From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. My name is Remco Tamis. Last week, our Asia Society colleagues in India, Hong Kong, Japan and Australia joined forces to talk about the upcoming US presidential election from an Asian perspective. Their experts discussed what's at stake for each of their countries in this election, whether people living there prefer Trump or Harris as the next president, and if the governments in Beijing, Tokyo, Delhi and Canberra see it the same way. For this episode of State of Asia, we are very happy to share the insights from this global Asia Society event with you. It was moderated by Anthony Bubalo, CEO of Asia Society Australia in Melbourne. We'll kick things off with Anthony introducing the four speakers you'll be hearing from.
So what does the forthcoming election mean for the world? What's at stake for the global community? We often hear perspectives from America and from Europe, but what does Asia think? And that's what we're here to discuss. And to do that, we've assembled a terrific panel from across the region, drawing on the networks of each of our centres. So joining us tonight to provide an Australian perspective, even though she's actually joining us from Malaysia, where she's on a research trip, is Dr. Natalie Samby. Natalie is a Senior Policy Fellow here at Asia Society Australia. And because we like to provide value to our audiences, I will also be asking her tonight, not just about Australian perspectives on the election, but also about Southeast Asian perspectives. Joining us from Hong Kong is Deborah Mao, an Asia-based broadcast journalist for Bloomberg TV and a former Taiwan bureau chief for Bloomberg News. From India, we have Harsh Vardhan Shringla, a distinguished former Indian diplomat who served as India's foreign secretary from 2020 to 2022, and who is previously India's ambassador to the United States. And from Japan, we are joined by Hiroyuki Akita, a commentator at the Japanese media organization Nikkei, who writes commentaries and analyses on foreign affairs and international security issues. If you had to name one or two issues that are most at stake for your country in the forthcoming US election, what would they be? Harsh, let's start with you.
Before I answer the question, Anthony, I thought I'd just take a few seconds to put the India-US relationship in some perspective. Over the last 2 decades, the relationship has seen a transformation of the likes that I think is very rare, moving from estranged democracies to engaged democracies. So today, we and the United States are cooperating across the board on areas like trade and investment, technology, defense, a robust people-to-people engagement. There's practically no US Fortune 500 company that doesn't have a presence in India. So given these synergies, it's obvious and it is only to be expected that the US presidential election would be watched with a great amount of interest in India and perhaps a little bit of trepidation as well. Coming to what two issues could be of the most importance to India in the election, I would say that India would like to see a strong United States that takes a proactive and constructive role in maintaining global peace and security. In an interdependent and interlinked world, what happens in a conflict in Europe can resonate adversely on countries across the globe, thousands of miles away, in terms of the costs of their rising costs of imports of essential food and fertilizer and fuel, but also in terms of tourism, remittances, etc., indebtedness. So I speak not just for India and our neighboring countries, but also the entire global South, when I say that we would like to see a United States that is proactively working to end conflicts in Europe, in the Middle East, and maintain global peace and security. The second issue that I think is important for us in India and again for the developing world on the whole is the need for the US to focus on economic growth and stability. A stable US economy augurs well for countries across the world, whether it is in terms of controlling inflation or ensuring that currency fluctuations are minimized. So from that perspective, I think we would certainly like the US to play a responsible global role and essentially focus on global peace and security and global growth and stability. And I think these are the foremost that come to any country in the developing world or across the world. And from India's perspective, of course, a focus on issues like the Indo-Pacific is important. But then I think, broadly, those are the two on my wish list.
Thanks, Harsh. Deborah, I'd like to go to you in Hong Kong next.
Giving sort of the Chinese perspective on what is happening over in the U.S. Obviously, there's a very long list of issues to choose from flashpoints in regional security to trade and economics. But I want to sort of direct people's attention to one piece of messaging that has become very clear in recent days, coming from the top leadership in China. And we saw it, when Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, visited China at the end of last month. And since then, there has been further government commentary on this. But it's sort of this what the leadership is seeing as underlying why relations are so bad right now. And that's a need for the United States to somehow achieve a better understanding of China. Part of this is China's motivations, its values, its calculations, what it wants to be in the world. We saw President Xi Jinping. This was the top point that he raised with Jake Sullivan. It was echoed by the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, Zhang Youxia, who's pretty much number two to Xi in terms of the military, that the US needs to fix what is an incorrect strategic understanding of China and return to a more rational, pragmatic policy. And then perhaps Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave the most descriptive articulation of what they mean by this incorrect understanding. And he says the US should not speculate about China based on its own experience and should not project its own model of global dominance onto China. And all of these comments were followed several days later by significant commentary in the People's Daily, which is seen to be a pretty accurate guide of what central policymakers are thinking. And again, reiterating that an accurate strategic understanding of China is the first step towards any patching up of relations. Oftentimes, these sorts of comments don't get a lot of coverage in the media because it's sort of philosophical in nature, and but it is significant that it is coming from the top Chinese leadership at this particular point in time, and it really signals that the government sees a very different view from the US, where any strong country would seek to dominate and form alliances, which is what the American mentality tends to be, and this desire to shape the world according to its own national interests. So China perhaps underscoring that it doesn't cover all of its motivations and interests. So coming back to the question, what's at stake here in the current election? I think China is looking for the next administration, whoever leads it, to achieve a much better understanding of China, its motivations, its thinking, and to set aside sort of these Cold War-based assumptions and to reset the narrative with more positive thinking for the future. And obviously this affects everything from issues around regional security to trade war and industrial policy, and everything in between. And secondly, I think China also is looking at being able to align with the United States in the future on issues of global significance. So things like the crisis in the Middle East, bringing Russia and Ukraine to the table for talks, and other issues, crises really, surrounding the climate and AI, which is requiring a lot of global coordination and cooperation that may not yet be where it needs to be.
Thanks. Hiro, we'll go to you next in Japan.
Thank you very much for having me. So maybe since Mr. Trump scenario and Vice President Harris scenario are so different, so please let me share with you Japanese perspective on each scenario. So first, Trump scenario. So when Mr. Trump was president, Japan did not suffer big shock compared to Europe, mainly because Prime Minister Abe had exceptionally good relation with Mr. Trump. But Japan is aware that there is no guarantee that Japan will enjoy same success next time. So there is a strong awareness that if Mr. Trump gets elected, Japan will face paramount pressure on security and trade. But that is not the biggest concern that Japan have. The biggest concern is that Mr. Trump may eventually strike a deal with a country like China or Russia or North Korea at the expense of Japan or other US allies, especially on China. Since Japan is facing China, Japan worries that Mr. Trump may start by imposing huge economic pressure on China, but if China will come up with a very attractive trade deal, Japan worries that Mr. Trump may take it by making a concession on Taiwan or other security issues. That will, in long run, that will destabilize Asian security situation. So that kind of a deal between US and China over the head of Japan could be that nightmare scenario for Japan, rather than huge pressure on security burden sharing or trade. On Vice President Harris scenario, of course, we all expect that there will be a much more consistency. But it is also likely that Vice President Harris will not get satisfied only by tracing Biden foreign policy for all 4 years. So at some point, we assume that Ms. Harris will try to differentiate. My perspective is that generational difference. Mr. Biden spent long political career during Cold War when US played a critical leading role to fight against USSR. But Vice President Harris became a senator in 2016. It is 3 years after then President Obama announced that US will not play the role of world policeman anymore. So even though Vice President Harris has very tough stance against Russia and also tough on China, but it may be possible that Vice President Harris will pursue more pragmatic or realistic approach to, especially to China, whether good or bad, being aware the limitation of US state power.
Thanks, Hiro. And finally, Natalie, a perspective from Australia. What matters from this election for Australia and also for Southeast Asia? Obviously, separate question, but we'll get both those perspectives from you.
In the first Trump administration, for the most part, the Australia-America relationship was relatively shielded from a lot of the shocks that was mentioned earlier with respect to Europe. So we've got a very strong alliance there. And we may not be so lucky the second time around with the Trump presidency. I think Australia will be also concerned about the extent to which the United States will continue to play a responsible leadership role in the Indo-Pacific. Now, ultimately, Australia is looking for the prevention of the kinds of instability that would be not conducive to economic growth, not only for itself, but to its closest neighbors as well. It's looking for a lack of preponderance of power. And so ensuring that the United States continues to play the balancing role and continues to become a good security partner and economic partner, not only for Australia, but for its partners in Southeast Asia is of critical importance. And one of the things I think underpinning the extent to which the United States has the bandwidth to be able to play that constructive Indo-Pacific role is the extent to which it has domestic stability. And when we look at increasing polarization across the United States, one also wonders the extent to which they might have a resonance effect of the kinds of issues about immigration that we're also seeing resonating in parts of Europe and the UK in places like Australia. And I say that because there have been studies that show that extreme right-wing rhetoric across American social media websites is starting to become reflected in Australian rhetoric as well. And so what we don't want is a flow-on effect of the kinds of instability that's happening domestically in the United States to start permeating our national conversation about immigration and about Australian society and our place within the region. So again, that's perhaps a minor point, but I think something that we're not paying as much attention to, and the extent to which the political circumstances of the United States not only affect Australia in a domestic sense, but perhaps also impede its ability to play that really constructive role. So I think that would be the concern of domestic issues and then a wish for the United States to continue doing what it's doing to the best of its ability. Now, if we take that from Southeast Asia's perspective, the United States has become a good security partner for many countries in the region. Indeed, it has a lot of allies as well. But if you look at the latest survey, the State of Southeast Asia, held by our colleagues in Singapore, the ISEAS think tank, of the main concerns facing Southeast Asia, elites in those countries nominated unemployment and economic recession and widening socioeconomic gaps and rising income inequality. And inevitably, Southeast Asia will be looking for opportunities, not just from Japan, South Korea, India, other partners in Australia, but certainly the United States. The extent to which Vietnam has been looking for recognition to be a different kind of a competitive economy, amongst other things, a market economy. These are the kinds of things that our region will be looking for from the United States. So indeed, I want to reiterate a point Deborah made. Not only will Southeast Asia be looking for those economic opportunities, but it will also be looking to not being continually placed in a position of having to choose. The United States will often say that it's dropped rhetoric about this, pushing Southeast Asia to choose between the US and China. I would hope under whichever administration, whether it's Trump or Harris, that there is, in Deborah's words, a better understanding of autonomy and agency amongst Southeast Asian states. And this is not necessarily about winning over one side or another. It's about understanding the interests that Southeast Asian states have and learning how to be not only a responsible leader, but a really constructive partner as well.
If your country had a vote in the election, who would they vote for? Would they vote for Trump, or would they vote for Harris? And would the kind of the popular vote align with the desires of the government of your country? So would the government be hoping for a different candidate? Would be hoping for a similar candidate? Deborah, let's start with you and talk about China. I know, difficult question, but if you had to guess, if the Chinese people got a vote, who would they vote for?
Generally speaking, there's certainly less kind of distaste for Trump in China than there is in the United States. Not to say that, they love him, but there's, I guess, more popular kind of support for Trump than the government might signal. So the social media on Trump tends to focus on his wealth, his business experience. Just recently, Barron Trump, his youngest child, going to NYU was trending. And generally speaking, the kind of pro-Trump camp in China tends to be people who enjoy that he's a realist on international affairs. Domestically, he's sort of anti-woke, tough on China, which appeals to certain liberal parts of the Chinese population. The pro-isolationism is something that appeals, and perhaps this end to U.S. moral high-handedness is sort of lecturing the world that Trump is not likely to do. So those are the things that kind of appeal to the Chinese public. On Harris, social media today say she's younger, she had more vitality, and she was much better at staying on topic. However, there was a lot of criticism about what's perceived as, media bias towards this candidate. Interestingly, Walz, her vice presidential pick, his China experience does not seem to get very much play at all. People don't seem to care. And then on the other hand, for Harris, there is a lot of this tabloidy coverage around her personal life. So, linkages to former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, calling her, a mistress, that type of thing. And then just recently, some details about her husband, Douglas Emhoff, and his personal life. So the Chinese population is sort of all over the sordid details over there.
Hiro, let's go to you next. The Japanese people get a vote. Who are they voting for?
70% Harris and 30% Trump. That is my instinct. So maybe interesting part is why 30% people may vote Mr. Trump. Let's start from that. Mr. Trump is a very, very unpredictable and sometimes very, very, how can I say, disruptive. But at the same time, when we look back the first term, thanks to Mr. Trump's pressure, all US allies in NATO's and Asia have realized that we cannot keep cheap riding or free riding or cheap riding on US security umbrella and have significantly started to increase the defense budget. Japan decided to double defense budget from 2022 to 2027. So in a way, Trump shock halfway functioned quite well so far. And also, second reason, this is only two reasons. Second reason is that Mr. Trump basically wants to make America great again. So I'm sure that he's a transactional, and also as I said, he may make some deal with the other great powers at the expense of US allies. But if he persists with that notion that America have to be great, maybe it could be a last resort that Mr. Trump will not make a catastrophic decision to weaken the US leadership in the future. So maybe that is two reasons why. But the 70% Harris, because obviously she's more, we can expect more consistency, and also, of course, she is likely to make much of US alliance network. Japan and also US other allies in the US is already committed to invest more for security. And in that context, Harris is good. And also, lastly, most importantly, on Russian invasion to Ukraine. Vice President Harris categorically said that we have to win. We means we have to defeat Russia. But Mr. Trump said we have to finish. He want to finish the war. I think that finishing a war by potentially forcing Ukraine to compromise on some part of territory could lead to a more catastrophic scenario in long run. So that is another reason why I think Harris is more favorable.
Natalie, who are Australians voting for?
Look, I think it really depends in the Australian context. If you're more, as Hiro mentioned just now, if with Trump's anti-woke agenda, if you're of an ultra-conservative persuasion, then you might find someone like Trump more palatable. You may find a strongman figure more palatable. If you're more on the progressive side, you may look for a Harris leadership. I think if I am going to skip to the region, though, I think because it's important to talk about the extent to which this is looked at from a regional perspective and how hard it's generalized. So just quickly picking up Indonesia as an example, looking at Trump at the potential, again, as I said earlier, for economic opportunities, bolstering, the prospect of jobs for a large population, a very young population as well. But at the same time, the growing discontent with the current president and the ways in which laws and the Constitution have been manipulated. So potentially a Harris presidency that might promote democracy, human rights, and anti-corruption could equally be appealing. So it's not such a clear-cut answer, I think, but I think the number one issue for certain countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, would be the way in which the United States handles the ongoing conflict and bloodshed in Gaza, certainly.
Finally, Harsh, how is India voting?
So let's start with Kamala Harris, who's of Indian origin. Her mother was from India. In 2019, when she came onto center stage, she was one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for presidency. This was greeted with a great amount of interest and even euphoria in India. Even some villages, around the area that her mother actually belonged to, that had, idols of her in temples. So obviously there was a great amount of interest, and you can imagine that one of our own would had the possibility of assuming the most important position in the United States of America. So that was the feeling behind it. But as time passed, that interest seems to have waned. I was reading an interesting article in the Washington Post, a recent one, in which it said essentially that as her, presidential contest draws closer, India seems to view her differently, more muted in terms of her connection, but also, uncertain about her strategic stand on India. I would look at it differently. I would say that she's a politician. She understands that in America, to be identified with as a person of African American origin is far more important from a vote bank perspective than to be identified from an Indian origin perspective. And I think that's perfectly understandable. Of course, she hasn't visited India. That's one factor. So there's less familiarity from that perspective also. But she'd have a lot of people who would vote for her simply because of what would appear to be a more sympathetic consideration of issues such as women and children, issues of relating to immigration, healthcare, education. So there would be a lot of people who would see her from that perspective and would be inclined to support her if they had the vote. On the other hand, Trump is a known commodity in India. Now, I was in the United States when we had this famous event called Howdy Modi, when Prime Minister Modi and President Trump jointly addressed an audience of 50,000 Indian Americans in Houston, Texas. And that event was the most televised event in India. Trump was seen in every household in India. And in 2020, Trump visited India and he was greeted, he received a tumultuous welcome. There were 100,000 people in that stadium, that one stadium, to listen to him speak. And I think he got a sort of welcome that he'd never had, possibly never had even in the United States. So essentially, Trump is known in India, but also many of his policies, and because he is known, his policy has been seen as favorable, pushing back on an assertive China, keeping geopolitical balance, inclined to engage on a free trade agreement. And for a lot of Indians, his recent statement that Indian students studying in America could be eligible for the green card came as a major boost. But Trump has one more Indian origin trump card, which is Usha Chilikuri Vance, the wife of Senator J.D. Vance, is of Indian origin. So he's got that also behind him. But I would say that irrespective of who wins, I would say, in the sense that from an Indian perspective, I think there would be clearly support for both candidates. And as far as governments are concerned, governments are agnostic, but I think the government here can sit back and be quite content about the fact that whether it is Donald Trump or whether it is Kamala Harris, the relationship would continue to receive the sort of attention that previous presidencies have given it. So we are pretty agnostic about how it is. But certainly, I think both would get a pretty good vote, and it's similar margins that you'd see in the United States, I would say, in general.
Our respective countries might meet a second Trump administration with some trepidation. And in this case, if we could go around and perhaps talk about what has your country's experience been with the first Trump administration? What are perhaps the main takeaways? Deborah, do you want to start off with that, please?
Yeah, sure. I think Trump administration from 2016 to 2020 just marked this collapse in U.S.-China relations that nobody saw coming, and was greatly almost traumatizing. So this, Trump's reorientation to great power competition sort of caught people by surprise and, has persisted to this day, as we can see. Meanwhile, there was also a bypassing of multilateral organizations like the WTO in favor of tariffs and forms of unilateral pressure that, again, was not expected and quite disappointing. And then there was a bypassing of China on other global issues, like dealing with the North Korea issue. All of a sudden, Trump and Kim Jong-un were meeting without the consultations that would have happened in the past. So China had to deal with that by sort of stepping up. There was a suspension of funds for the WHO that, China then had to pony up the money to ensure that the World Health Organization was funded, tided over. And so we're still kind of dealing with the aftermath of everything that happened in the Trump administration, and that since then continued by the Biden administration. And we can see that some of that the hangover is affecting Chinese domestic policy to this day. So we can see, for example, from the recent third plenum that a lot of the industrial policy is almost in response to all of these external shocks that sort of began during Trump's first term.
I'm from Taiwan, so I want to know what's the perspective or the concern from your regional countries on the impact of China-Taiwan issue post US election.
Let's ask you, Hiro.
Taiwan issue is one of the biggest concern if Mr. Trump become a president again, because his recent remark, he said that Taiwan should pay for its defense. And also he said, it is not first time, but he said that Taiwan had stolen the semiconductor industry from US. Under that perception, I wonder if how much extent will Mr. Trump help or devote its security commitment to Taiwan in time of contingency to defend Taiwan. And Japan is very, very close, geographically very close to Taiwan. So if there were to be a war between China and Taiwan, whether Japan will, like or not, Japan will maybe get entangled.
Deborah, there's a question from online. I'm not quite sure where from, but a question we received, quite an interesting one I want to pose to you. What are the realistic prospects of US-China cooperation on either Gaza or Ukraine, given sensitivities about China's closer relations with Russia and with Israel's opponents in the Middle East? And how might I'll throw in, how might the election affect the potential for that cooperation?
I think China still maintains that globally there's a misperception of where it stands in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Wang Yi in this last round of meetings was adamant that the idea that China is supportive of Russia is absolutely false, and that is sort of a false narrative being perpetrated. The fact that they sell components that can then be assembled for military purposes within Russia is not a situation that is particular to China. I think China itself is optimistic in terms of the mediating role it can play in terms of bringing Russia and Ukraine to the table, as long as there is alignment from the United States. And so in terms of between the two candidates, it appears that Trump is probably the more likely, if he were to win, that's a more likely scenario.
Natalie, a question here asking about China's approach to regional forums and particularly the Global South. The question is, China's established another potential regional framework for developing countries, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS Initiative, and it's enhancing cooperation with emerging markets. What do you think? I mean, how is that being viewed in ASEAN, and how might the election affect or shape a potential US response to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I looked at the sort of tail of the question. I talked about the US being left behind. I think I have to bring us back to that desire in Southeast Asia for a lot of the rhetoric talking about the options of Southeast Asian countries to drop the binary use, the idea of competition, the idea that the United States is losing. The only winners that should be in Southeast Asia should be Southeast Asian states. And to that end, what Southeast Asian states needs are a menu of options. And as they see it right now, China is providing options. These may not be the best options across all domains, but Southeast Asian states, particularly Cambodia, where I was a couple of days ago talking to the Ministry of National Defense, who said to me in no uncertain terms, if China is providing options, we will look at any arrangement, any multilateral fora that is a contributor to a positive security environment in the Indo-Pacific. But it doesn't mean that the United States has been abandoned. It doesn't mean that the United States has stopped becoming a partner of choice in certain domains, such as security and certain economic areas. So I think, again, we have to take a holistic look at the way in which Southeast Asian states are looking at the options provided to them, and then see whether or not which administration, whether it's the Harris or the Trump administration, are providing options that actually marry up with the needs of Southeast Asian states, not just the needs that the Americans think that these countries need. So again, something like Biden's Initiative for Democracy, that has a lot of merit in terms of reinforcing certain democratic ideals in the country. Countries like Thailand, where the youth really wants there to be robust, fair, and free elections, amongst other things. But is that something that all Southeast Asian states are looking for? Is that a priority? Is that something that other states are providing? Those are the kinds of more granular, more specific analyses I think that needs to be done. But first and foremost is understanding that Southeast Asian states will pursue a multitude of options, and that does not necessarily look like a zero-sum game for the United States.
I'm joined again by my colleagues Nico Rustinger and Serena Jung to chat a bit about what our colleagues in Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, and India have pulled off, and getting together these 4 experts from these 4 countries to talk about the US elections and their perspectives on it. And I was wondering what stood out to you, Serena.
I really thought it was an Asian perspective, so it was really diverse and well represented. The Indian agnosticism, because they kind of count off further engagement on all levels.
I want to acknowledge the incredible job that our colleagues across those 4 centers have done. We know how hard it is to put together any event, and then, especially, across 4 time zones and 4 different places. So really well done, and we're really happy that we can also feature that conversation on our podcast. I was reminded at several points throughout this conversation about a line from our very own senior fellow, James Crabtree, who in a piece that he'd written, but then also when he was here, said several times that his current assessment is that the Europeans are clearly overestimating, meaning freaking out a bit about the possibility of a second Trump term. But then he also said that he thinks, a lot of the Asian governments are maybe underestimating a little bit the effects. And I think some of this here shown through, right? It's an expression of the pragmatism that he said. It's like, we can work with anyone. There's kind of this undercurrent of like Asian countries will be fine. Like they can deal with either one of those options. It doesn't nearly feel as existential of a decision as it sometimes does in the European context. I think that's right? I don't think it's existential, but I'm also wondering whether maybe they're underestimating a little bit sort of the calamity and chaos that at least the second Trump administration would bring.
I think Hiro in Japan did point towards that in talking about Taiwan. He said, well, we did have Trump recently say, well, Taiwan should pay for their defense like he did with Europeans and NATO in his previous term. He said, well, Taiwan stole our semiconductor industry. It's of course election talk, but it is a bit like the talk he had towards Europe. Well, he might just as well repeat it, but then in an Asian context.
I was also reminded in what kind of different world we were living only before 2020. It's not only a Trump presidency over, but also there was a pandemic in between, and I think just another Trump term would accelerate us into another whole different world that we cannot think of. And I think part of it is also the nuclear conversation that is recurring in the United States, but also with different allies who know what Trump said last time.
I think, again, Hiro in Tokyo made this point that I'm paraphrasing him, but basically I think his argument was the Trump shock was useful in a way because it made everybody, including Japan, ultimately realize they can no longer rely as much as they used to on US defense and sort of posturing. But then he also seemed to say, well, that shock was useful, but we only need it once, right? So it's sort of like why would you want to get this shock a second time? Because everyone's learned their lesson. And then we move on. And I think that was an interesting point. The other thing I picked up on, which I think is a very good observation, was from Deborah Mao in Hong Kong, who said that the first Trump term was a bit of a disappointment for China. And again, I think it's easy to forget because it's a while ago, but I think China wasn't totally unhappy with Trump being elected in 2016. And I think there was maybe a hope, sort of that, again, this would sort of lead to a more transactional sort of thing. And there actually, I think she correctly pointed out, a lot of things the Trump administration did, not just sort of not even in these kind of overall relationship, but she brought up all these like actual issues, the WTO, the WHO, so of him basically going over China's head and meeting Kim Jong-un. So I think maybe China's also cooled a little bit on Trump, while I think there's still, as the main geopolitical adversary, you may want to hope for the guy becoming president that you see as, sort of introducing more domestic instability. Maybe it's also become a little bit more wary because it may not actually, the Trump administration may not introduce policies that China will find to its liking.
She also called it the collapse of US-China relations that is still felt today and was traumatizing for China, which I think is a different view than one is used to. And I also think that Japan is wary of Trump striking a deal with China. I mean, he mentioned it. They should not get too close, or because the allies will be left to the side.
The other thing that I really like Natalie Samby pointing out, and I think that's a really crucial issue that we here in Europe tend to completely forget, is how important, at least in Southeast Asia, how important of a factor the war in Gaza is. I mean, we obviously pay attention to it here. It doesn't seem to me that we see it as a crucial factor in the election. And it may not be a crucial factor in the election because it's the Americans deciding, not the Southeast Asians. But I think sort of the huge role this plays in public discourse in many Southeast Asian countries, and the way this also shapes their perception of the US, I think is greatly undervalued here. And I think we do well to pay a lot more attention to that.
And that's all for this episode. Of course, the full video of the event is available on the Asia Society YouTube channel. A link is in the show notes. That's where you'll also find links to details on all our upcoming events, how to become a member of Asia Society Switzerland, and other ways to support us. Our next episode, out in 2 weeks, features Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, one of Indonesia's foremost political and foreign policy experts and former advisor to the highest levels of power in Jakarta. Indonesia will inaugurate Prabowo Subianto as its new president on October 20th. So it's a great time to check in on what's happening in one of the largest democracies in the world and by far Southeast Asia's largest economy. Professor Anwar is traveling to Zurich to be a speaker at our State of Asia conference on November 7th. More on that on our website, asiasociety.org/Switzerland. Follow State of Asia in your favorite podcast app so you won't miss a thing. My name is Remco Tanis. Thank you for listening.